Good morning. Welcome to today's guide to transcutaneous monitoring. You are in the right Zoom webinar room. We're going to get started here in just a minute. Just let you get settled, let you get your sound checked, and we'll get started in 1 minute. I'll give you a little bit of information to take a look at while we're waiting to get started. Okay, we'll get started. I appreciate the people who chatted back to me and let me know that they could hear me. That really helps as a presenter, so I appreciate that. We'll be going through a sleep clinician's guide to transcutaneous monitoring and some principles of that technology today. I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to the presenter, who will be Eduardo Hernandez. And after his presentation, we will have some live question and answer sessions and an evaluation and continuing education registration. So real quickly, we'll move to some housekeeping. I just want y'all to know that your audio and video settings are in the off mode. We won't be watching you during this meeting, but you'll be able to see at the very least Eduardo, and I might even pop on there eventually. If you do need to adjust your volume, if you take your mouse and you hover over the lower part of your screen, a little panel will pop up and you'll see a picture of a microphone. It's probably muted right now, but if you go and use the drop-down arrow, it will allow you to adjust the volume in case you can't hear us okay. To submit question and answer questions, please click on the Q&A button at the top, at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A, and it'll take you to a point where you can type those in. We will definitely try to answer all the questions that pop up. But just in case we run out of time, we've asked for a non-anonymity to your questions so that we could actually follow up and send you some answers afterwards if we don't get to the question online. One more tip, there will be a few polling questions that pop up, and if you can, click on an answer to the poll. That'll help us know a little bit more about you and a little bit more about your sleep lab, answering some questions that we might have. We may have a couple fun ones that pop up too. They only stay on the screen for a few seconds, so if you can answer quickly, that's great, and we will capture that information. As far as the CEUs, I want y'all to know that following the sessions, there'll be an evaluation that will pop up in your browser. And we need you to fill that out. It's necessary for the CEU credit documentation. Please fill that out. And then you'll get a certificate of attendance by the end of the month, probably in the next couple of weeks. Just so you know, this program is approved through the AAST for 1 contact hour, and it's also approved through the AARC. And you can let us know which certificate you need, or we could probably tell by your credentials which certificate you'll be needing. So let us know about that. All right, that brings me to introduction of Eduardo Hernandez. Eduardo is our speaker today. He is a polysomnographic tech at Nemours Children's Hospital in Florida. Eduardo received his Bachelor of Science with a major in respiratory care from the Universidad Metropolitana of Puerto Rico. He currently sits on the board of directors for the RPT and is a member of the BRPT exam development committee for your certification and registration and the CCSH exams. Eduardo was chosen as a subject matter expert during the BRPT standard setting for both exams. So he knows a lot about a lot. Eduardo has worked at various hospitals in Puerto Rico as a sleep tech and is currently working at the Nemours Children's Hospital Sleep Center where his passion for pediatric sleep technology and medicine grows every day. The only disclosure we have for Eduardo is that he is consulting with Centec in order to do our speaking today. All right, we've got a poll question that should be popping up. All right, in the results of our poll are that there are 12% of you who are feeling excited today. There are 50% of you who are feeling calm. I'm sure Eduardo's one of those. 29% of you are feeling happy, and 8% of you are sleepy. Thanks for taking that poll. I think we've got another one that's going to populate here in just a second too, maybe a little more serious. Let us know when you're reopening. Are you already open? Are you opening sometime this month in August or September? We should probably add one more thing that says we're getting ready to close again. It's been kind of an interesting last couple of weeks, so it'll be, I'd like to see your results. So go ahead and fill out your poll. All right, 88% of you are already open. Only 2 of you are opening this month, 2 of you are opening in August, and about 3 of you, or 5%, are opening in September or later. So thanks for sharing that. All right, we'll move on. I'm going to go ahead and start Eduardo's slides. So Eduardo, here you go. Now y'all get to see Eduardo. He turned on his video.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, there you go.
For the detriment of others, right? You had to have to see it. Luckily, I'm not spotlighted here. It's the presentation itself. Thank you, Robin. Thank you for having me. So these are mainly the objectives that we're going to be talking about today. Now, I gotta let you guys know I love this topic. I love transcutaneous monitoring. So it really seems kind of like it's a perfect fit for me to talk about this. So kind of step by step here, we want to understand the differences available in sensor technology. There are a couple key differences, and we'll go in that, in a little bit later in depth. We want to discuss the principles of CO2 monitoring. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we breathe, the physiology, kind of like a nice review of the way that we breathe and that kind of thing. We want to also review the limitations of end-tidal CO2. I know a lot of labs do use this technology. I know some labs don't. Many labs use it strictly for detecting hypoventilation in patients. We'll talk about that in a little bit. We also want to review and we want to understand the successful application techniques, because you just can't slap these sensors on and then pray that it works. There's a couple little key takeaways that you got to do in order to get a quality signal. And then we're going to be reviewing the guidelines for cleaning. Everyone knows that, especially in this time of pandemics, that cleaning and maintenance is very important, especially for something that is reusable and not necessarily disposable, like these transcutaneous monitors are and these sensors are. So kind of reviewing how we breathe, right? CO2, carbon dioxide. When we don't breathe, our body tends to build up CO2. So pretty much the reason that we breathe is to kind of get rid of that CO2 that's been built up in our body. That's through that product of cellular metabolism through the Krebs cycle. When we breathe, air enters through the bloodstream, or enters through the airway, and then it goes down to these little sacs in our lungs, which are called the alveoli. And that's where what's called diffusion happens. So that's where we exchange the gases. CO2 coming in, we exchange it into the blood, and then the O2 coming in, we exchange it into the blood. CO2 that's already in our body, we're exhaling that and we're taking it outside of our body. So as it says right there, it's important to understand that alveolar measurements, it's about 40 millimeters of mercury for CO2 versus the capillary, which is about 46. Now that's relatively close. That difference, it's pretty small, which means that CO2 has excellent solubility. So there's other things like bicarbonate and things we're not going to get into. We don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, into the woods, but just have an idea that the main physiology of of respiration is to get rid of that CO2, as we can see kind of blown up here. To try to kind of go and take a step back here before we get a little bit more in depth, we want to know what transcutaneous monitoring is. It's a non-invasive method that, that measures our capillary PCO2. It gives us an estimate of arterial CO2. So capillary, you know, we can measure that through the skin. Arterial, obviously, we get that through ABGs, arterial blood gases, that kind of thing. So it's painful, you know. It's an invasive method when we get the arterial blood gases, but it's very direct. So this PCO2 kind of avoids that invasive nature in order to give us the numbers that we need. And as we'll be able to see in the next slides, the PCO2 is very, very indicative of what those arterial CO2 values are like. Many of you might have seen or heard many variations of what we refer to as transcutaneous monitors or transcutaneous monitoring. There's a lot of different abbreviations there. The main takeaway of this slide, it's important that you don't confuse the TC, the transcutaneous, with the end title, that PET CO2, because there are different ways of monitoring. Yes, the same thing, they use the same kind of measurements as far as millimeters of mercury, but there are completely different ways of monitoring this. And we'll get into a little bit more in depth about the differences between that. So a long history, all these medical advancements and in technology that have been going on that have brought us today to our transcutaneous monitoring, our current use of transcutaneous monitoring, started just the other day in the 1700s, nonetheless. So, you know, many hundreds of years ago, we've been taking all of these developments in medical and technology developments up until the 50s and 60s, where Stowe kind of developed the first PCO2 electrode, but Severinghaus was the one who first applied it to human skin. In the 1970s is when it started being used on neonates and infants. All of these were kind of analog methods. The recent sensor technologies, as far as digitalization of sensor technologies, have really given us a lot more sensor stability, more robust signals of the sensors, of the TCO2 sensors, and also longer sight times. That's very important when we're talking about continuous and non-invasive monitoring, that those sight times can be monitored up to 12 hours per patient without having to recalibrate the sensor and potentially lose some data in between. So let's go over a little bit of how these sensors work. As you can see, there's kind of a tan bar down there. That's our skin. And up on top, there's a gray kind of a bubble, and that's the sensor that is connected to these transcutaneous monitors. So we can break this down a little bit. The skin has those capillaries, and what the sensor wants to do is try to heat itself up in order to kind of bring those capillaries closer to the skin surface in order for us to get good readings. Now, inside the sensor itself, it's pretty smart, because there's a couple different things that you can see going on. On the right-hand side, there's a key that has optodes. You can see the heating resistors. Once those are turned on, those capillaries start getting closer to the surface of the skin. But in between that, there's a couple things that we need. We need some kind of a membrane, a sensor membrane that can be able to be permeated with CO2, because if not, we're not going to be getting a good reading. But also, we don't want to just place that membrane on the skin itself. We need to have some kind of a conductive or a contact gel, some kind of a solution, in order to make sure that those values are as indicative as possible to what PaCO2 could be. So that's where you have that CO2 permeable membrane and the measurement electrolyte. So that's where inside that electrolyte, that's where these different types of, you know, the CO2 with the water and the bicarbonate and the hydrogen ions start kind of doing their reactions in order to give us a good signal. As I mentioned before in the history slide, we have come a long way. In the 1970s, there was analog transcutaneous monitoring that we were using. I had mentioned that we're able to go the recent updates in digital sensor digitalization. That's where you can kind of see the bullet points of the main differences. So the digital, one of the important things to know is that it converts the signal processed in the sensor itself, not necessarily in the monitor, but all that conversion and processing happens inside the sensors. It's a very smart sensor that you know, enhances your data quality, your sensor stabilization. Cable lengths can be longer because all of the math, all of the calibration, all of the formulation is going inside the sensor instead of taking the time to travel to the monitor itself. And then the sensor is pretty smart because it has a memory, so it can kind of allow you to be going longer without having to recalibrate, which means taking that sensor off the patient, putting it back in the monitor, and again, you're losing data. Obviously, you can see in the bottom there, the analog kind of method of doing things is when it's processed, it's in the monitor itself, which means shorter cable lengths have to be available in order to not lose any signal. And it is susceptible to quality loss, noise, interference, artifacts, that kind of thing. Obviously, longer cables really help with patients. I mean, I work at a pediatric sleep hospital, a pediatric sleep lab. Longer cables really help when you have these active patients that sleep in every which way known to man, you know, all these different positions here. So it is very beneficial to have those longer cables and not have to sacrifice the signal quality. We got another poll here. So based off of that last slide, who's that kid holding the analog brick phone? I'm not giving you any hints here. Let's see our age range of our participants.
I'm pretty sure I had a brick phone like that, Eduardo. If that tells you how old I am.
I've seen one in a museum once.
All right, we have our poll results. It looks like 76% of you knew that that was Zach Morris. So I'm going to guess that most of you are between 30 and 40 years old, maybe. AC Slater got 7% of the vote. Doogie Howser, who was, of course, always my favorite, got 11%. And Corey Matthews got 6%. So thanks for participating in that poll. Here we go. Back on track to the content that's important.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about end title limitations and challenges. I had mentioned earlier that there are some differences with sensor technology. There's also differences in the way that we monitor CO2. And we're gonna talk a little bit about ventilation perfusion ratios. My background is in respiratory therapy. I don't know about our participants. We're gonna keep it as basic as possible. I do apologize if it's too basic for you, but you know, we wanna make sure that everyone understands kind of this basic understanding of, again, how we breathe and what happens when those processes aren't working the way they should be. As you can see here, ventilation perfusion, there's a ratio that indicates how well our alveolar ventilation matches to our pulmonary capillary perfusion. So that V is that measuring that alveolar ventilation. It's more or less about 4 liters per minute. That Q of the VQ ratio is our blood flow. That's what it's measuring, about 5 liters per minute inside the body. So if you take that 4 divided by 5, the ratio will give you about 0.8. That's a normal VQ range. So keeping in mind normal VQ range, I don't know about you guys and gals that are listening here, but many times in the sleep centers and sleep labs, we have patients that are anything but comorbidities, respiratory issues, cardiac issues, that kind of thing. So let's get into what happens when those VQ ranges are outside of normal standards. Again, in the middle here, we have that normal range that you can see what happens you know, when we inhale and the normal oxygen that goes into the capillaries, the CO2 that goes back out, as we had talked about in that slide earlier. That's what a normal ventilation perfusion should look like. But on the right-hand side, we have instances where something is abnormal. There's a mismatch between these VQ. For example, these are you know, cardiac patients, patients that you have you know, kind of cardiac abnormalities or anomalies, shock, sepsis. We'll see that the perfusion is not doing what it needs to do. And the kind of the takeaway from this is that if you're not having a normal ventilation perfusion ratio, what you're going to be exhaling is not going to be indicative of what's in the arteries, the CO2 values that are going through these capillaries here. So for example, if you're exhaling a value that you're recording via end-tidal CO2, it really is going to be varying vastly based off of your arterial CO2. Now on this left-hand side, as you guys can see, this is mainly more attuned to, I would say, the majority of sleep technologists and sleep clinicians. This is mainly what we see in the sleep lab. COPDers, sleep apnea patients. If, for example, if there's a shunt, there is no ventilation or gas exchange. Or if there's reduced ventilation for whatever reason, if there's obstructions in the airway, or if there's any types of other reasons, again, what we're going to be monitoring and what we're going to be capturing from that end-tidal CO2 monitor is not indicative of the actual CO2 arterial values. So that's why the end-tidal CO2 could be a little bit inaccurate as far as what's really going on inside the body versus what we're exhaling, and it's being captured in that exhalation. So that's been proven. What we just talked about, these VQ mismatches, have been proven with a couple studies. Now, this study was done by Storr, and this was in a 57-year-old COPD patient. There's about 3 different values that we're monitoring here. All 3 are for CO2, but that black dotted line, as you can see, that solid black line is the transcutaneous CO2 values. We have one that's kind of jumping up and down all over the place, and that's that end-tidal CO2 measurements. If you can kind of focus, there's a couple red arrows. That's your arterial CO2. Pretty much what the slide says, it jumps at you, jumps out at you as the time goes by. This is about a 70-minute time period. The transcutaneous CO2 levels were most in conjunction with the arterial CO2 levels, with minimal kind of differentiation between the two, versus the end-tidal, where you can see it was jumping up and down during those 70 minutes, how it would get close, how it would go back down. Maybe the patient was mouth breathing, maybe the cannula got loose, whatever interface you're using to measure that end-tidal, it looks like it wasn't as consistent as the transcutaneous monitoring was. Now it can severely, it means that it could severely underestimate these CO2 values. And then this other study that was published in the British Journal of Anesthesia, there was a comparison done between end-tidal and transcutaneous measures of carbon dioxide. I know in the sleep labs, we tend to not use general anesthesia. However, we do tend to see severely obese adults and children for that matter. So I thought it was a pretty good takeaway that you could see how on this left-hand graph, which is the transcutaneous and the arterial CO2 kind of correlation, and the right-hand graph, which is the end-tidal, you can see the end-tidal vastly differentiates. There's a bunch of there's a lot of difference between the two values, versus on the transcutaneous that it seemed to be kind of in the same ballpark, a lot more consistent between the two values. So we've seen that the AST and the ASM have published pretty much in our standard for scoring, the scoring of sleep and associated events. There's a couple of recommendations here for using the the transcutaneous monitoring in the labs. As you can see right there, some of the bullet points. The main takeaway, as you can see, it's highlighted in red during PAP titrations, and we'll get into this a little bit later. In both adults and children, arterial or transcutaneous PCO2 are the recommended methods to detect hypoventilation. I know a lot of labs, as I had mentioned before, mainly use end-tidal for detecting hypoventilation. But we'll get into the reason why transcutaneous might be more beneficial and more consistent and long-term monitoring when we talk about these patients. So I've talked about in the past, how people have mentioned, well, it's been told to me that, and we all know that the gold standard for the longest time was end-tidal CO2 monitoring, especially for pediatrics and for, hyperventilation patients and other issues, right? Other conditions. Pretty much people have said it's so easy. If you can breathe, you can monitor end-tidal CO2. Now, that's good, right? Because we want to make sure that all of our patients are breathing. If not, we have an issue. We got to do something about it. So in theory, or it's okay, right? But in practice, you see something like this. you know, I see this all the time when I'm running pediatric studies, especially the younger ones. You can see that we get a little curious with these cannulas on our face. Things can happen where we're congested, other issues in the upper airway, you know, runny nose. All these types of real life biological things will be kind of contaminating our end tidal readings. The other example that I like to use a lot is we are enormously, our faces and our fingers are enormously sensitive to the touch. I like to use this example a lot where, you know, think about your first date with your significant other, when you first held their hand, you know, the shock that went through your body, when you first had that first kiss, you know, that sensitivity in the area as far as around the mouth, underneath the nose, and the tips of your fingers are enormously sensitive. So it's not a shock that the main reasons that we go into these patients' rooms are to replace a removed cannula, to put on a removed pulse oximeter, because we just got to keep that in mind. If you're sleeping in the middle of the night and you feel something on your face, subconsciously or consciously, you're going to be swiping at that. So that could be a limitation to end tidal CO2. When you have something on your face that you're monitoring that, your first instinct in the dead of night while you're asleep is to swipe at it and you know, rip it off. And it's important here. We're going to be talking a little bit about alliteration, about the uses, the application, the site selection. First, we want to talk about some real life cases where transcutaneous could offer a potential solution to these aforementioned end tidal problems. For example, in titrations, we've seen that with patients on BiPAP. So all my technologists that are listening, think about when you're titrating a patient and that pressure support, so that difference, that delta between the IPAP and the EPAP, if it becomes too high, say we've already titrated obstructive apneas, we're good to go, so the airway's open, but now we're still trying to titrate for those partial upper airway obstructions, snoring or hypopneas, we want to increase that IPAP. If we increase it too much, and all of a sudden we're causing that patient to blow off too much carbon dioxide, that patient will go under that apneic threshold and they'll start developing centrals. You know, many times techs will hear, you know, don't titrate too quickly, you know, you'll create central apneas, or be careful, that kind of thing. And it's mainly because of that reason. Either they're not getting used to the pressures if you're on CPAP, or if you're on BiPAP, you've increased that pressure support too much, where now their body is blowing off so much CO2, they need to stop breathing. So that way the CO2 kind of accumulates and it keeps rising up inside the body before you can blow it off again. That's why transcutaneous is really important to monitor this. Now, about the titrations, you don't know who you're going to be splitting in a lab many times, unless it's an ordered split, I understand, but many times if you have an emergency split, you can't predict that. I know sometimes there's a joke where the technologist will say, oh, this one's a for sure split or this or that, but you know, you really don't know. In the pediatric realm, we've had very thin patients, you know, that their tonsils are kissing, their adenoids are enlarged, and versus the you know, 350 overweight, obese patients, and they're more severe than them, the skinny kids. So you can't really, you know, predict who you're going to be splitting. With that in mind, if you need to, if you're using end tidal CO2 monitoring and you had to split that patient, and that patient required higher pressures, all of a sudden, either you can't keep it's not comfortable to keep the cannula underneath the mask. If it's a nasal mask, you might have to remove the cannula altogether. And if for some reason you didn't put on transcutaneous, or if you put transcutaneous beforehand during that diagnostic portion, pre-split and then after split, you might have a continuous reading of that CO2 instead of having to sacrifice it with end tidal CO2 management. So some key considerations here, I had mentioned before, non-invasive and continuous are phenomenal when it comes to the context of a sleep lab. The last thing we want to be doing is waking up the patient and taking arterial blood gases for their CO2 readings in the middle of the night. Hold still, I'm going to stick your arm, this and that, especially for respiratory therapists. So this method of monitoring CO2s non-invasively, so no shots, and continuously is very important. Now, keep in mind, there is a warm-up period. It usually takes about 5 minutes once you apply the sensor to the patient for it to start reading, for it to start stabilizing. Many times, the way to get around this is before the patient comes in, try to do a last-minute calibration, or right when the patient comes in, do a calibration. There's many methods of how you do it versus what monitor, that kind of thing. I'm not going to get into that too much, but doing that when the patient comes in is a kind of a good tip and trick. That way, or once you're setting up the patient, you could also calibrate that. That way it's ready for you to record up to 12 hours during the study. You want to set up everything so that way you can minimize your interactions throughout the night with the patient. Because it's a sleep study, if you can set up everything beforehand and they're not swiping at a cannula and they're keeping their pulse ox on and you are getting a CO2 value, a CO2 reading, that's a successful night if you ask me as a technologist. So, if you go back, I forgot to mention, perfusion is key. When you take this, when you're picking a site for a patient, it's very important, as you'll see in the next slide here, that there are certain areas where perfusion has been proven to be better than others. If you have poor perfusion in the area, you're not going to be getting a good reading. For example, you can see here, there are recommended areas with neonates and with adults, children as well. It's one of those things where you have nice guidelines of where you can place these sensors and where you can get the best reading that that gets the closest to the arterial PeO2 value, PCO2 values. My personal favorite, kind of a tip and trick here, I really love that subclavicular area. So on the adult, it's a red area, and then on the neonate, it's labeled number 1, kind of right in the shoulder-ish area. So that I find that to be a great area to use, just because if for some reason, in the aforementioned example, if you do need to split a patient, sometimes you have interfaces, masks that have a forehead a forehead piece to it, and if you already use that forehead piece to use the monitoring for the transcutaneous area, you might have to move that site. So to kind of strategically place it under the subclavicular area is my favorite. But with that said, there's a couple things that you can keep in mind. You also have to keep in mind that the patient, if they're known to sleep on their stomach or on their back or on their side, you always have to keep those things in mind when you choose that site. So it's not that you just slap it on and go with it. There's certain areas that will have better perfusion and certain areas that might be more strategic based off of the patient that you have. But that's the way I like to do it. I think we have another poll coming up. Let's see here. There it is. Yeah, so I like to do the subclavicular area. What about you guys? What's your preferred personal preferred site for monitoring adults, and I guess your lab as well? What's that preferred site that you like to monitor CO2 or transcutaneous CO2? All right. I guess I was in the majority here. I hope I didn't sway your guys' voting opinions, you know what I mean? I was worried that if I said that everyone would pick it, but it sounds like everyone's, the majority is on the same page here. The forehead is exactly what I would see. We see it in our labs as the second. So it's kind of indicative of what I've seen in the labs that I've worked at. Subclavicular first and then forehead second. Yeah, seems about right. So let's keep in mind, I want to go through the steps of how you apply this. We had mentioned before site selection, but before you even do site selection, you want to assure that your sensor, once you open up the little docking station where your sensor's in, you want to make sure that your membrane on the sensor, that piece that goes in between the sensor and the patient, doesn't have any air bubbles in it. It's not ripped, it's not torn, it's not lifting up from the sensor itself. Because since this is all due to perfusion, if you have some kind of extra air, room air, that kind of thing, lifting up the sensor, you're not going to get a good reading. So after you've inspected the sensor, you want to go to the patient and you want to pick your site. keeping in mind again, if this patient is more prone to moving around a lot at night. Many times in adult labs, there's almost a component that you have to keep them on their back as long as possible, which is very difficult for adults, especially with obstructive sleep apnea. We all know why, what the gravity does to the airway, that kind of thing. So you want to make sure that you keep in mind your type of patient when you're selecting the site. So then once you've selected your site, you're going to insert the sensor to that site. You want to make sure there's a good seal. If for some reason it's lifting up, if the cable's too short, if the monitor's too far away and the cable has too much tension on it, if there's not any conductive gel in between the sensor and that site, all these things can definitely contaminate your sensor, your readings. After you assure that there's a good seal, you want to check the status. You want to keep in mind, does your patient have anything that could be causing any types of VQ mismatches, as we had discussed earlier? If there's any perfusion issues that could potentially give you higher readings in the transcutaneous monitors than the actual ABGs themselves. This is important for the sleep, kind of how we integrate what's on the monitor to our sleep study itself. I know I've been in a lot of labs where budgets are a thing, you know, and the camera systems aren't the best. They might not have the pan functions, or there might not be a high definition zoom. So if you're running a transcutaneous monitor and you can't pan or zoom that camera into the actual, as you can see at 22.9 there, you can't see the value on the camera itself, well, then that kind of defeats the purpose of you wanting to avoid the unnecessary going into the patient's room and that kind of thing. You really want to minimize that when the patient's sleeping, because again, it is a sleep study, and the least amount of interventions that we have with these patients, unless they're merited, of course, but if these are things that we can avoid, we want to do that. So these are the cables that would work with your current PSG software. You can calibrate them to make sure that everything's running smoothly, and the time that it takes for, I had mentioned before, there's about a 5-minute time where you place that sensor on the patient. It might not be reading for about 5 minutes. So don't freak out if all of a sudden you place the sensor on the patient and you don't see any readings for about 5 to 10 minutes. It's because, you know, it takes a little time, that digital sensor, to stabilize. So it's extremely important, once that on your PSG software that is reading a transcutaneous value, that it is also being reflected on the transcutaneous monitor. That way you know that the cables are not faulty. You know that you did the analog calibrations the way that they needed to be to the sleep study. Again, for labs that don't have camera systems that are state-of-the-art, that you can zoom in 100 times and kind of compare what's being recorded on the study versus what's being recorded in the monitor. It's important that the calibrations that you do are as accurate as possible, and your hardware, you know, is working the way it should be. Obviously, this should all be done. It can be done throughout the night if need be, in real time, and it's very easy to do it. However, you probably want to do this before the patient shows up, just so that you can make sure everything's running smoothly. So keep in mind acquisition, right? Acquisition technologists, recording technologists. This is no secret that we are the eyes and ears of what's going on throughout the night. If there's an outside noise that causes an arousal, you might want to, you know, make a tech note, so that way, for some reason, if the patient changes sides or changes body positions, that all of a sudden transcutaneous values start rising, we can know that it was caused by something in the environment, or you can kind of you can rule out other methods of what's going on and why your values are rising or lowering, for that matter. But yeah, you know, this is something that's kind of a no-brainer, but it's important that people understand that transcutaneous isn't just a value on a recorded sleep study. It's not just in the report and that's it. It really does depend on the acquisition technologist to assure that that signal is as valid as possible. So jumping to the scoring technologists, we talked about acquisition. Now scoring, there are some very specific standards and measurements of how we or how doctors interpret and narrate and diagnose hypoventilation, and transcutaneous monitoring is a very important way. And again, it kind of goes back to the acquisition technologies. We want to make sure that we have a good site, good seal, everything is going, any types of changes are recorded by that acquisition technology. So that way, when you're scoring it, you can be as certain as possible that these values are indicative of what's going on in the arterial CO2 values. Those are the these are pretty much standards for pediatrics and for adults, the hypoventilation scoring criteria. I had mentioned before that long-term monitoring is long-term, and I'd also mentioned, I just wanted to review up to 12 hours. That's really important to know, because the average sleep study in the adult world is about 6 hours, in the pediatric world is about 7. So knowing that you can kind of have almost like a confidence that your transcutaneous monitoring is going to be lasting the time before and after, lights on, lights out, lights out, lights on, that kind of thing. It really does give you confidence when, again, if you're diagnosing hyperventilation or CO2 values, that kind of thing, it gives you more confidence knowing that these are built for monitoring up to 12 hours. Now, if we're talking about outside of the sleep lab, maybe in a NICU or PICU setting, because sometimes inpatient sleep studies are done, this is also very important to be able to continuously monitor that. So one of the things that you have to keep in mind, though, is site protection. And I think we're going to see in a next slide here, in a couple of slides, that there are some certain patient populations that you have to keep in mind. This sensor does generate heat. That's the way that it brings those capillaries closer to the skin and to be able to read those CO2 values. Now, obviously, you have to keep in mind different skin types and that kind of thing, which we'll talk about a little bit. As you can see right here, we have neonates, we have geriatrics, we have maybe burn victims, we have all these different types of skin sensitivities. It doesn't mean that transcutaneous cannot be used on it. It just means that you have to maybe change sites more often. You can change the temperature of the sensor itself, so you can lower it or raise it as needed. Most likely you'd probably be lowering it with sensitive skin, or if you raised it, you would probably have to change the site more often, just so that we can protect the integrity of the skin and minimize thermal injuries. It's important that you also follow manufacturer's recommendations, aside from doing the clinical assessment of what type, skin types, that kind of thing, because these manufacturers do know, for example, if you do lower the temperature, it might not be as accurate because you're not heating the skin as much. But every manufacturer definitely has their guidelines for sure and their recommendations. So it's important to follow that. Another important thing is that these sensors do not live anywhere other than their docking stations. Whether you keep them outside, ready for patient use, that kind of thing, it's important that you keep it there in its docking station at all times, unless it's on a patient. It's important because there's self-calibrations that go on, that kind of thing. But it's also important that before each use and after each use, you do clean, obviously assuring the integrity of your sensor membrane. It's important that you clean with alcohol wipes or any other methods that you use to clean in the hospital. You want to make sure that there's no dried up contact gel around the rings or anything like that. Now, talking about this method of cleaning, we are currently still in a pandemic. It's important to know that even though this is not disposable, these transcutaneous monitors, there are ways that we can disinfect and reduce possible cross-contaminations and infections and that kind of thing. It's usually recommended for the life of the membrane itself. And these monitors are very smart because they'll tell you when you need to change the sensor membrane or when one is recommended to be changed. And that also goes with the manufacturer's recommendations for cleaning, that you use some kind of a cleaning agent. In our hospital, we use alcohol prep pads. If for some reason we needed something stronger based off of patient's conditions or anything like that, we might use something stronger, but we would also wipe whatever that is, because that'll still stay on the surfaces, with an alcohol prep pad as well. So, in that sense, it's important to keep the health of your patients, the health of your staff, everyone as healthy as possible. So a quick little summary here. Remember your checklist. Before you're about to place a sensor on this patient, you're going to want to start in order: sensor, site, seal, status. This is all perfusion based. So we are pulling from the capillary bed, from the skin here. And even the slightest bit of pressure could alter your readings. So for example, if you have my preferred space or site for placing transcutaneous monitors, those sensors, if they're laying on their stomach in that prone position, pressure on that sensor will definitely alter the results that you're readings, that you are reading. So you want to make sure, again, keep your patient in mind. If for some reason they're on their back and it's in their subclavicular area, they turn on their stomach, you'll probably have to change the site. If you cold start, as we call it, or change a membrane prior to a study, you're going to need to calibrate it. So it'll take a little bit of time to calibrate. So 8 to 12 warm-up time, 8 to 12 hour warm-up time is recommended. It's also important. A little tip and trick that I've personally seen. I couldn't believe this until we did it. I was kind of skeptical. You leave the transcutaneous monitors on. You don't turn them on and off with each patient use. If you leave them on, it will actually use less calibration gas, and you'll have to calibrate your membrane less, or your sensor less, which means it's less use, less calibration. So it's just like a car running, right? It uses more gases, uses more gas upon initiation, and then once you're coasting, it uses less gas. That's the kind of idea behind that. The last tip that I kind of wanted to let you guys know: in the sleep lab, we have patients that need to use the restroom at night, many times throughout the night. So it's important to know that these sensors can be off of the hookup of the monitor itself for about 10 minutes until it needs a recalibration, which means that if they're in the bathroom and back before 10 minutes, you're okay to just plug it right back in without having to recalibrate the sensor to the monitor. That's really important, again, when we have patients that go to the bathroom or anything like that. So thank you, guys. That's all we have for you. I hope there's a lot of questions here, or if you have any questions, feel free to write. We have that Q&A box down at the bottom right there. What do you think of the presentation? How are you guys using it in your lab? Give us some feedback, and we're here for you. So thank you, Robin. Thank you for giving me the floor here. I really appreciate it.
Hey, Eduardo, I just want to tell you thanks for a really good presentation. I hope people do have questions. I think I see some coming up. I've got a thank you. No question, just somebody said thank you. One person asked if they should leave the TCM on all the time. And I think, Eduardo, you kind of addressed that. You want to take that one again?
Yes, yeah. So I just wanted to recap. We were turning them off and turning them on with patient use, right? It ended up, we started kind of putting labels on gas canisters and seeing when the last time we had changed it out was, like the date. And we actually realized we did about half that weren't doing that and half that were just running continuously. And yeah, we had, I think it took us about I think 4 weeks, almost a month, that we were changing more often when we were turning on and off those transcutaneous monitors versus leaving them run. That's a huge difference. When you're again, leaving it running, uses less gas, uses less energy, versus turning them off and turning them on. They have to do those kind of long calibrations versus shorter ones if the monitor's running.
Great, thanks for sharing that. I don't know if you can see the questions and answers, Eduardo, but there's a really nice person named Lisa who said, "You must work with awesome people every day. Great job." You may know her, right?
Yeah, she may or may not be my supervisor at work, but yeah.
That's nice.
Thank you, Lisa.
Many and more positive comments for you, Eduardo. Anybody else have any questions regarding transcutaneous CO2 monitoring? I've got to scroll down. I think that might be. Let's see. One person says they've seen staff remembrane in midair and achieve good application with no bubbles. And I would like a video of that because I'm not sure that I know exactly what you're saying there, sir, but I think in mid evening, or at the middle of the night, if there's some reason that you might need to change a membrane, maybe it got damaged because the patient rolled over and accidentally removed the sensor and it scraped against the bedside bar or something, maybe that could have caused a problem like that. So that could cause a problem, and you might have to do it. And it's a little bit of an interruption to your sleep study, but having people that are aware of how to handle that situation, it's good. So if they've had to do it in the middle and they can do it without any air bubbles in that membrane, that's awesome. That means they're really great. So thanks for sharing that. Let's see, someone asked for a request of the slide summary tips to be able to share with staff. And I'll throw that back to our producers who are in the background, and maybe when they follow up with the eval and the certificates, that we could share that with you. We did also, about a month ago, publish some tips on reopening sleep labs and getting your transcutaneous monitors up and running again, because some of them may have sat for a month. And so we'll give you some information on that too. Let's see, keep going down this list. Some comments that our lab started with 2 and now we have 5 units that they move around as needed. TCCO2 has definitely added to the quality of our studies and the ability to monitor patients accurately. Thanks for that feedback. We see that in a lot of places. They'll start out with a couple and eventually they'll have 1 at every bedside. One thing that Eduardo brought up, which I think is pertinent, is if you are moving monitors from room to room, we would advise that you do that little analog calibration to make sure that the numbers that are on your monitor are displaying on your montage correctly. And it's an easy, couple steps to do that. So just keep that in mind, that if you are moving them, that you ought to do the analog calibration with the montage. Here's a good one. How often should we change the membrane? When do we know our staff is abusing our equipment because we are changing it a bit too much? So that's a really good question. And it honestly depends on the manufacturer as far as what their guidelines are for changing membrane. I can speak on the behalf of Centec, but we recommend a membrane change about every 28 to 32 days or so. Some people can get it to go a little bit longer. And it really depends just on how much activity that sensor is seeing through the night. So I would say about every 28 days, and our monitor does have a timer and it will tell you when it needs to be changed. And that also is good because the life of the electrolyte, when he showed the template of that sensor, the life of that electrolyte is kind of finite. As you have chemical reactions occur, you use up that electrolyte. And so over time, you lose your ability to have that electrochemical process take place. So it is important that you do appropriate maintenance and change your membrane as needed. I've got a couple requests for recordings of the webinar, and I think that when they send you, they may be able to send you a link to the recording. Just a little insight from a customer who uses Centec, Lisa at Nemours, initially had recommended their change at about 34 days, but then I think they dropped it to 28. They sometimes get changed before that due to damage, but 34 was a little bit too long for them. So it really kind of depends on your specific lab. Question for when a tech remembranes a sensor, do they have to wait 6 hours prior to placing back on the patient? Do you want to answer that, Eduardo, or I can?
Go for it, yeah.
Okay. I don't want to take over the
No,
questions.
no worries.
You do not have to wait 6 hours. you can remembrane, you tell the monitor that you've remembraned, and it will ask for calibration at that point. So go ahead and do a calibration. That's going to take you 5 to 10 minutes. And then there is a recommended stabilization time. When you change a membrane, it's about 90 minutes. So, you know, it's up to you. Just realize that if you were to put it on the patient within that 90-minute window, it might not be as accurate as if you were able to wait the 90 minutes. A lot of the hospitals and labs have gone to routinely changing the membrane, like Lisa mentioned. Every 28 days, they've got it on their calendar. They change those membranes, and then that helps to alleviate some of the surprise membrane change requests in the middle of the night. So that might be a process that could help you.
What also helps with that, might I add, is that as I'd mentioned before, if these membranes live in that docking station, it's a very secure place to avoid any types of nicks or scratches or anything on that membrane surface. But if you're leaving it out, you know, to dry, as they say, it could kind of, you know, mess it up in that sense. So yeah, as long as it's where it needs to be, and as long as you're constantly, you know, whether it's alcohol or anything like that, that you're cleaning around the edge, there's like bevels of the sensors, that way there's no dried up gunk or, you know, this gel, the contact gel that we use, that's important for the life of the membrane itself.
Yeah, good point. I have a question, and I just typed a message back to this person. They asked if the sensor changes from blue to black or black to blue when it's time to be changed. And that is definitely not something that our technology has as far as an indicator. Now I can't go back up and see that, the rest of that question. So you might just send us a message offline and we'll answer that more, but we don't have any kind of indicator on the sensor that says it needs a new membrane. Our indicator is on the display of the monitor, and it will say membrane change due in X amount of days. I think there's a good question here. It's like, why is transcutaneous slightly higher than PaCO2? Is that an overestimation? And it goes back a little bit to Eduardo's explanation of ventilation and perfusion, but it's also relative at the skin. So if you think about it, we've got our arterial blood flowing into capillaries that are coming really close to the skin. We also have a little bit of metabolism occurring at the skin. So particularly if you have a problem with perfusion, maybe there's some pressure on that sensor, we'll start seeing our CO2 rise up a little bit. And even on a great day, usually transcutaneous tends to fall a little bit higher than your arterial CO2. We try to account for that within some algorithms within the monitor, but usually there is just a little bit of difference, and we do read a little bit higher. That was for Gus. You had put that question up there. All right. I've got some specific troubleshooting questions coming up, and we are trying to be pretty non-biased, but I want to let you know, someone says they have some Centec units and they've seen some DS leaks. And one of the biggest culprits, if you're seeing DS leaks, is that maybe that sensor's being placed back into the docking station with a little bit of dried up gel or, you know, sweat, skin tissue, whatever, just little bits of things that can stick to that sensor. And then when you put it in the docking station, it doesn't allow the docking station to close securely, and you might be getting a leak because of that. So you just want to make sure that the sensor is clean, very, very carefully wipe around the edges of the sensor, and maybe take just a very light wipe across the face of the sensor. And also every once in a while, it's recommended you take a look at the docking station itself and make sure that there's not a lot of buildup showing up in there. So those could be a couple reasons you have a DS leak. The other reason could be that over time there is an O-ring that is around the, or we call it a gasket, that's in that docking station, and that will either dry up or could get damaged over time, and that could be causing some DS leaks. Before we close, I want to give you all a little bit of information. If you are using Centec, we have a really great resource now for customer education and support. So if you go to www.centec.com/resources, that takes you to a whole lot of videos, a lot of tips. It takes you to some manual information, things like that, that are very helpful. We are straight up on the hour of 1 o'clock, and I could probably stay on a little bit longer and answer a few more questions. If you guys are willing to stay on for another couple of minutes, and then we'll sign off. That's all right. What are normal levels for adult, pediatric, and infant? I'll let you take that, Eduardo.
So that can definitely vary. If we're talking about normal textbook normal, we're looking anywhere between 35 to 45 millimeters of mercury. It can fluctuate a little bit, a couple up or down, that kind of thing. But that's, if we're talking about textbook answers, normal, adult, ped, that kind of thing, between 35 to 45 millimeters of mercury.
Yeah, not a lot of difference between age, and maybe in the neonatal world you might see just a little bit higher CO2s initially, but for the most part, for a lab, you can use 35 to 45, wouldn't you say, Eduardo?
Yeah, keep in mind with neonatals, since central apnea is considered let's say normal or common, central apnea with neonates, you might be seeing higher CO2 levels just because, the less that we breathe, the more that we retain, and that kind of thing.
I see a question. It's another product-specific question, but I'll let you know. What about in vivo calibration? That is an option, and it's not something that is very often used at all, partly because when you do an in vivo calibration, you're basically taking a blood gas, and you are getting the results of that blood gas, and then you're making the CO2 display on the monitor match that blood gas, which is great if you're obsessed with having those two numbers match. But it goes away after calibration. And if the patient's perfusion changes, I think it's probably better to use some other ways of troubleshooting and looking at perfusion, which Eduardo could really go into if we gave him another hour. He could talk about relative heating power and how that helps him troubleshoot. But I would say, honestly, I wouldn't recommend in vivo calibration, particularly for a sleep lab, because you've got to get that gas. Or in vivo correction, same thing. Yeah, I said calibration too. Let me look at my chat line just in case somebody's sending me a message that I need to pay attention to. Where do we go for our CEU? That's a great question. As soon as this presentation closes, you will receive an evaluation request in your browser, and fill that out, and that will be your ticket to getting your CEU. Going up just through some more questions. Man, those were great questions, everybody. I really appreciate that you were so engaged, which was very easy to be with Eduardo. It was great. And Stanford Children's shouts out and says, hey, we enjoyed today's presentation. So there you go, Eduardo.
Great.
Then we will look forward to hearing from you. We'll be communicating with you again regarding your CEUs. If you have questions, we can also probably connect you with Eduardo as a clinical resource for you.
Sure.
We'll work on that. And if you want to share your email, or we can send it out with the evals, I think that'd be a great idea.
Yeah, definitely. You can send it out. Yep.
All right. Work open questions. See, they're all great. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your week. And hopefully we'll be having another seminar coming up in the near month or two. maybe we'll go a little more deep dive into some specific product questions. So there we go. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.